Well, it's a great pleasure to be back with you all again this morning. Just want to say thanks to Derek for organizing the conference and for the kind invitation to come and speak. And it's been great fun hanging out with the other speakers and getting to know some of you during the break. It's been a real honor to be here. So on behalf of my wife and myself, thank you all. And thank you also to the staff behind the scenes. Anybody who's been involved in organizing a conference knows there are an awful lot of people sort of nameless as far as the attendees go, but whose hard work is absolutely critical to the smooth running of things. So thanks to all of the administrative staff and the catering staff who've made my time here so pleasant. I want to speak today. The two lectures today. I want to, in the first lecture, I say simplify things, not in a simplistic way, but to try to capture what lies at the heart of so many of the changes I outlined yesterday in my two lectures. Because I think in doing that, I set myself up for the final lecture, which is proposing some solutions. There is, I think, a great temptation at the moment to despair, because so much seems to be changing so rapidly. It almost seems pointless trying to keep abreast of developments, because as soon as one has got some kind of grasp of what has developed, new developments have already occurred. I mentioned yesterday technology, the constant development of technology feeds into this feeling that things are always slipping away from us. The German critical theorist Hartmut Rosa has a very, very helpful term for this. He calls it social acceleration. And he makes the point that, the printing press of the 15th century precipitated ultimately 150 years of bloody warfare in Europe as European society came to terms with the challenges and the changes generated by one technological development. We live at a time when technological developments are happening at a rapid speed, at such a rapid speed that we are incapable of reorganizing our societies around them, incapable of assimilating them before the next development hits the headlines. I work in higher education. 2 years ago, I hadn't even heard of ChatGPT. It is now the biggest challenge in higher education across the globe. And I'm sure that next year will bring further challenges. We will not even have been able to address ChatGPT before the next challenge occurs. And this can lead to a feeling that everything is always slipping away, that we are constantly losing control. As I said yesterday, technology brings this promise of more control. But actually what it often does is it makes them more and more dependent upon it and creates feelings of impotence and powerlessness. Well, in such a situation, there is, I think, a twofold temptation. One temptation is to despair. The second temptation, closely related to the first, is to get very angry. I think that neither option is legitimate for a Christian. The New Testament clearly indicates that Christians are to be people of hope. Faith, hope, and love are the great Christian virtues. Hope is critical to who we are. And I think anger, though very tempting, has to be kept very carefully within its limits. It is appropriate to be angry at some developments. It is appropriate to be angry at some of the things that are happening in society around us. But the danger today is that we can allow that anger to overwhelm us and eliminate the vision of the Christian life and of the Christian virtues and the Christian attitudes that we see laid out in the New Testament. So what I want to do in these lectures is, first of all, as I say, bring things down under some manageable headings and then point us to the fairly straightforward responses to these things. Now, I mentioned yesterday that the big question of our day is the question of anthropology. I said at every era of the church's history will often throw up a particular doctrinal problem. The 4th century throws up the problem of the relationship between the Father and the Son. The 5th century throws up the problem of the relationship between the two natures in the incarnation of Christ. The 16th century Reformation throws up problems of authority and sacraments, and of course, closely connected to those two things, the whole concept of salvation. Today, we live in an era where the issue is anthropology. Again, I said yesterday, we're somewhat, I think, transfixed politically by the question, what is a woman? But that question is only problematic because there is a collapse in consensus about the question of what it means to be a human being. We live in an era where, for want of better terminology, anthropology or the doctrine of man is the big question. And I mentioned yesterday C.S. Lewis's great book from the 1940s, The Abolition of Man, anticipates, certainly principially, so many of the questions we face today. So let's step away from the particulars that press in on us. The problems of gender, the problems of sexuality, the problems raised by pornography, all of the kind of things that I touched on yesterday. Let's step away from the particulars and ask, what are the general underlying problems that anthropology, that a doctrine of man has to address today? And I would suggest that all of these symptoms that we see in the world around us, questions of gender, questions of sexuality, we can actually see them as symptomatic of two broader convictions within our culture. One is that human nature in and of itself has no intrinsic moral limits. And secondly, human nature has no given moral end. Two things, really, two sides of the same coin. In other words, the problem affecting us today is this. It's that we don't think that human beings have a moral purpose. Not a moral purpose that is given to us non-negotiably, intrinsically, in the fact of being human beings. And if we think of the problem that way, then I think we can start moving towards understanding what the church's solution to that might be. And the first thing I want to do here is encourage you by saying that although the specific symptoms and I think the intensity of the problem are somewhat unique to the present day, the problem itself is as old, almost as old as history itself. We are not facing anything principially that is different from what has been faced by human beings throughout history. To cut back to what I said yesterday and to point forward to something I'm going to reiterate today, I think a lot of the difference for us today is technology. It's intensified the problem, but it's not fundamentally changed the problem. It's not a new problem. The idea that human beings have no moral limits and no moral end, or are able to invent those for themselves, is clearly there in the account of the fall in Genesis 3. When you think of Eve, she sees the fruit. She makes a couple of correct judgments about the fruit. She sees that it's beautiful to look at. She sees that it's good for food. She knows that physically she can reach out and take it. The mistake she makes, of course, is she divorces those judgments from any kind of moral framework or moral teleology. I mentioned yesterday, the thing that makes Freud so plausible and powerful is that he's kind of 90% correct on some things. One might say that Eve was sort of 75% correct in her analysis of the situation in the garden. It was the fact that she dismissed moral structure and the teleology of human beings that becomes problematic. And I want to pick this up. You're all very familiar, I'm sure, with Genesis 3. I want to pick it up, though, in another story, because so much of what we face today manifests itself in the realm of sex and sexual desire, I want you to turn to another passage in Scripture that brings this out, and that is 2 Samuel chapter 11. Famous chapter, of course. It's the account of David and Bathsheba. It occurs at a key moment in David's reign. David has successfully supplanted the house of Saul. He has dealt decisively with the various domestic and external threats that he faced. He has, picking up on what Mario was talking about yesterday, he's dealt generously with at least one of the descendants of Saul. David is at the zenith of his power. And you'll know as you read through 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, this is the hinge on which David's reign turns. That things will never be the same again. If we were to use sort of broad biblical language about this passage in Samuel, we'd say this is kind of the fall of David. This is the moment when he crosses the line. A line over which he can never cross back, certainly politically. He will be paying the price for his actions here for the rest of his reign. But let's read together verses 1 to 5. Follow along in whatever translation you have. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Very interesting passage there for a number of the things that I want to bring out in this lecture today. One of the things I said yesterday was that the modern concept of what it means to be a human is very uncomfortable and very impatient with the notion of obligations and dependencies. It's summarized rather beautifully in a perverse sort of way, I suppose, but summarized rather beautifully by Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous statement that man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Certainly a philosophy by which Rousseau himself sought to live. He had 5 children, and if you know anything about the life of Rousseau, you'll know that he sent all 5 of his children to an orphanage shortly after their birth. An orphanage in 18th century Geneva would have been a death sentence for the child. He really practiced infanticide by proxy. You might say, well, that's a sort of horrific thing to do, and certainly most, if not all of us here would agree with that. But it's also consistent with his philosophy, I think, on the grounds that, what is a child? A child is a link in a chain. The child is that which binds him. But his anthropology, his notion of being a human being, is that whereby what counts, what makes you truly human, is your autonomy, your freedom, your independence, your lack of any dependency or any obligation that you have not voluntarily contracted for. By the way, just as an aside, we know about Voltaire's treatment of his children because Voltaire leaked it to the press. His great literary rival, wanting to destroy his reputation, got that story out there. If you read Rousseau's Confessions, you blink and you'll miss it. He feels obliged to mention it because Voltaire had leaked the story, but he deals with it in a single paragraph and says, well, I'm sure the orphanage would be a better father than I would have been. If that is true, then he would have been a pretty appalling father. Anyway, think about that. Think about that relative to this passage. Who is David? David is the king. King is not a private citizen. The king has a peculiar role in ancient Israel. On one hand, he sort of represents the people to God, and David at times will take on a priestly kind of role as king. But he's also meant to embody within himself the values of the people of God. The king, if you like, is the nation in microcosm. And this is not an ordinary nation, of course. This is the nation of Israel. We might say David, therefore, has the task of being the ideal representative human being. Remember what the task of the people of God was in the Old Testament? It was to be a light to the Gentiles. The people of God were to reflect the character of God to the nations around them. I will return to this passage, to a passage later, but remember that passage in Deuteronomy where the Lord says, I am the Lord your God who loves the widow and the orphan and the sojourner. You too should love the sojourner, for you were sojourners in Egypt. The people of Israel have a public responsibility to the nations around to reflect the character of God. And the king has a public responsibility to reflect the character of God, what it looks like to be made in God's image to his people and the people around. The king, if you like, has intrinsic moral limits and an end or a purpose. What does he do here? He rejects that task. One can perhaps psychologically understand why he might have done that. Leaders, precisely because they are leaders, take more hits than ordinary people. It's a more tiring and exhausting thing to be a leader. One can easily imagine David deciding that it's time to cut himself some slack. Commentators are divided over whether the first verse indicates that David is already delinquent, because it's saying there that he's not out with his men at the time of year when kings normally lead their men into battle. We have passage elsewhere in Samuel where Joab, his great military leader, specifically says, we don't want you with us. And there's certainly an argument for kings not being on the front line of the battle. So I'm inclined to take verse 1 simply as saying, David was in Jerusalem and his men are out on the battlefield. The real problem begins in verse 2 and following, where we see David rejecting the moral structure of kingship, the moral structure of humanity, and the moral end of kingship. And what's interesting is how that leads him to treat other people. It is very interesting, is it not, that Bathsheba in this passage is consistently referred to as the woman, except when in the context of being referred to in relationship to her father and her husband. Now go back to what I talked about yesterday. Remember I was talking about pornography? And I talked about the sexual revolution. I said one of the things that the idea of sex as recreation does is, to use the language of the English philosopher Roger Scruton, it changes faces into bodies. And I made the point that on a wedding day, the bride only wants to marry the groom that she's engaged to. The groom only wants to marry the bride he's engaged to. I could elaborate beyond that and say, and that's because the purpose of the wedding, in a sense, is not what you can get out of the other person. To use, Kant was mentioned yesterday, to use Kantian language in a positive way here, the purpose of marriage is to treat the other person as an end in themselves and not a means to an end. What do I mean by that? Well, you can intuitively grasp that a little bit by thinking, for example, about those weddings that sometimes reported on the news where a couple get married in hospital because one of them is suffering from a terrible terminal disease. Say they're in the latter stages of cancer, and they get married in the hospital bed. And maybe by the time the news is broadcast that night, the one who's ill has already died. Well, I'm betting that very few, if anybody, ever watches those news reports and thinks, what a stupid thing to do. Why bother getting married when you're only going to be married for 90 minutes and one of them's going to die? We don't intuitively respond to those news stories like that because we intuitively grasp what marriage is about. Marriage is not about one person getting something from somebody else. Marriage is about one person giving themselves to somebody else. The other person is the end, not the means to an end. Marriage, we would say, is all about faces. It's all about names. You don't marry a body. You marry a person. You don't marry an object. You marry a subject. Now, return to the passage. When is Bathsheba an object and when is she a subject? She's a subject when we have references to Uriah and Eliam. She's the woman with reference to David. David is treating her like an object. Now again, commentators debate, is this sort of standard adultery at one end, or is it a forcible rape at the other? I don't want to get into that debate particularly, but what I would say is there's no doubt that the passage is trying to communicate the idea that David is treating her as an object at this point. She's just a body, not a person. That's why she is consistently the woman with reference to David, and Bathsheba only with reference to Uriah. And the next time that her name is used in this passage, of course, is after Uriah has been, murdered by proxy by David, and she mourns for her husband. By the way, a little bit of Bible trivia. Eliam is the son of Ahithophel. So Bathsheba is his granddaughter. Ahithophel, of course, will become one of the great traitors in David's later reign. I've often thought, if I have a granddaughter now, she's very young, but if in 20, 25 years' time, some guy broke up my granddaughter's marriage and had her husband murdered, it would stretch my loyalty to that person. There's another tale to be told about Ahithophel, I think, on this front. She's treated like an object. Notice, too, David feels no obligation towards her. Not at this point, anyway. Sex for him is just about what he can get from the person. It is not sex as teleology. Sex as the seal on a unique marriage relationship. Sex as designed to promote the family. It's just what takes David's fancy that day. All of this is therefore to say that what we have here is a great example of the logic of modern anthropology back in the Bible. Now, why is that helpful? Why is that an encouragement? Well, I would suggest it's a reminder to us that the issues we face today are not unique and are anticipated in the Bible, and therefore we can reasonably assume that the Bible has the answers for us. There's a great temptation throughout human history. Particularly it seems, I'm a church historian, particularly it seems in the Christian church, to always think that the day in which one lives is the worst generation since time began. You go to the 17th century and the Puritans are complaining about the lack of godliness in their era. I love those diaries they've been publishing from inhabitants, citizens of the Netherlands in the 17th and early 18th century, where they complain. You have the habit or the tradition in Dutch Reformed Protestantism of preaching through the Heidelberg Catechism on Lord's Day afternoons or evening services. And it seems like a great idea, but then we find in these diaries that congregants are always complaining that the minister is simply recycling the same sermons year after year after year, and what are they paying him for, and how ungodly the ministry is today, etc., etc. There's a great temptation, I think, to look at any problems we face in our own day and generation and assume they're unique and unprecedented. One of the tasks of the historian is always to say, you're at a party and somebody says we live in unique and unprecedented times, and the historians say, well, actually, in Florence in 1244, exactly the same thing happened. There is nothing new under the sun. There is a sense, as I said earlier on, that the problems we face today are perhaps more intense than they were before because of the immense power, destructive power, that technology has delivered into our hands. But the principles or the logic of the problems has not changed. The idea that human beings have no moral limits, have no given ends, and can invent those for themselves to the extent that they can get away with things, that's not new. That's not new. Here it is in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now it's become, this rejection of teleology and moral limits has become something of a mantra in the modern day. One of my favorite 19th century thinkers, not because I agree with what he says, but because I think he's a great thinker and he's entertaining to read, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, I think, is the great Western thinker of the 19th century. He's the man who brings the whole thing to an end in some ways. And what does Nietzsche do? Well, Nietzsche realizes that the Enlightenment has got rid of God, pushed God to the margins. Kant needs God to sort of keep everything stable, but he certainly doesn't need God in the way that Orthodox Christians would consider themselves to need God. The Enlightenment has marginalized, neutralized, pushed God to the margins, but has pulled off a sleight of hand. Nietzsche sees that what the Enlightenment has done is it's smuggled something back in to do the task that God used to do. And what is that thing? Human nature. Human nature still has a moral structure. You've got rid of God, but human nature still has a moral structure. And that leads Nietzsche to see the whole concept of human nature as being oppressive. As soon as you start to talk about individuals having obligations, dependencies, having a moral structure, simply by virtue of who they are as human beings, you are oppressing them. That is a very powerful current in modern culture. It has a different form, but it kind of comes down to the same place in the work of Karl Marx. Karl Marx develops the notion of ideology. He does not coin the phrase, but he elaborates the notion of ideology. Ideology is what? It is that set of moral codes and social practices that normalizes the power structures necessary for maintaining bourgeois capitalism. What you do is you grant the moral behaviors necessary to maintain capitalism an objectivity that effectively allows you to oppress people. And that twin pole of Marx and Nietzsche in the 19th century really does set us up in the 20th and 21st centuries for the idea that moral codes, at least traditional moral codes, are inherently oppressive. Seeds of it we find in Rousseau's critique of culture. Don't think he ever uses the term noble savage, but that idea that, well, if human beings had not been civilized, we would actually be much more moral. We would treat each other with empathy. It's only, Rousseau, one could summarize Rousseau's thinking by saying, as soon as you have rules, you know something's gone wrong. Because human beings should be naturally empathetic towards each other. And this, of course, has become commonplace in modern culture. Again, one of the questions is, how does this iconoclastic view of morality become commonplace among the people who sit in the pews, the people who walk along the streets? Well, I think we live at a time when we've had 150 years where the normative artistic icon is a transgressor. You get that in a sense in Dostoevsky. I love Dostoevsky's novels. I teach a course at Grove where we read great chunks of the Brothers Karamazov together. The great thing about Dostoevsky's books, of course, is that all the characters are Dostoevsky. He uses different characters to articulate the battle that goes on within his own breast. But think about Raskolnikov, the anti-hero of Crime and Punishment. How does the chief of police first get on the trail of Raskolnikov? Well, Raskolnikov has written an article, an essay, arguing that greater human beings are those who transgress, can break the rules. And he murders the old moneylender and her daughter as a way of demonstrating his superiority. I think he refers to the old woman as a cockroach at some point. When you think of British culture, you probably never think of British culture, but let's think of British culture for a second. Who is, I think, the great harbinger of modernity in British culture? And I say British because he was not English, he was Irish. Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is a fascinating figure. You may have heard of the Nietzsche notion of the Superman, the Übermensch. Often associated these days, you think of the Übermensch, you think of brown-shirted stormtroopers. Well, no, I think closer to Nietzsche's vision is Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is the great artist. His whole life is a work of transgressive art. He nearly gets away with it, but not quite. He comes, like Nietzsche's madman, too early, and the British establishment destroy him for it. But Oscar Wilde is the great harbinger of the modern era. If you read his great essay on Jesus Christ, De Profundis, Out of the Depths, it's a fascinating essay. He loves Jesus. But what does he love about Jesus? He breaks all the rules. Jesus is the great transgressive individualist for Oscar Wilde. And what exists at an elite level in Dostoevsky, in Wilde, has become widespread in pop culture. Hollywood. I had a student a few years ago. In my humanities class, I allow the students to choose their own topic. And this young woman asked if she could write an essay on apologies, saying sorry in Hollywood movies. And I said, sure, go, let me know how you get on. She came back and she found out that in the last 20 years, she had not been able to find a single Hollywood movie where children apologized to parents. She found many Hollywood movies where parents apologized to children. Think about that. Go back to that social imaginary concept. What normative notion of family and family structure is being projected there in an apparently harmless way, but no doubt a powerful way in terms of forming intuitions. Transgression becomes normative. Hierarchies get inverted. It's slightly off topic, but I think this is one reason why certainly in the United States and Great Britain, maybe it was the same on the continent a couple of years ago, why certain strands of critical theory resonated with people who'd never read a word of critical theory. What is critical theory? It is a fundamentally, as the word suggests, critical practice of dismantling the status quo. It is an act of what one might call continual creative destruction. Why does it appeal at a pop level to people who've never read the great critical theorists? It resonates with the spirit of the age, which is a transgressive spirit of the age. If I'd got my other notebook here, I'd have quoted from Goethe's Faust again. In that first initial encounters between Mephistopheles and Faust, Mephistopheles not only challenges Faust to think about technology, he also makes this statement at one point. He says, I am the spirit that negates, for everything that is worth only to be brought into non-existence. That's the spirit of transgression. Everything that is must be torn down. I was watching the BBC this morning. Of course, England are playing tonight. We're terrible. I'm not a big football guy. I'm more of a rugby guy. But they'd got some guy whining about how critical the press always are of the England football team. Well, they are rubbish, and they deserve to be criticised. But the press capture the spirit of the modern age. Whatever is only worthy of being torn down. We might also look then, as we move out from moral limits, look at teleology, the idea of ends. Teleology has been critically important in ethical thinking since Aristotle. The idea that human beings have a given shape to which individuals are to conform themselves or to give attention in order to be fully and truly human has been a commonplace of ethical thinking since Aristotle. For Aristotle, it was the political man. Man as it is most human when he's engaged in the public activity of the public square. It gives us, of course, the antonym of the idiotic man, from where we get the English word idiot and idiotic. The idiotic man for Aristotle is the private man who has no interest in the public square. He's a deformed human in some way. He ignores the proper end that he has as a human being to be something less than truly, fully human. Then we move into Christianity. Ends, purpose, very important. Pervades the Bible, of course. The whole of the redemptive story, as Jim so beautifully brought out yesterday relative to marriage, has an end or a telos that makes sense of the whole thing. There's a direction there. If you look at the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages, structures the Christian life in terms of ends. You don't have to go to Aquinas, though. You go to the Westminster Shorter Catechism. The very first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism in English is, what is the chief end of man? What is the chief end? It's not that man only has one end, but what is the major end? The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And the rest of the catechism flows from that. And when you get to the discussion of the Ten Commandments, the idea is, if you like, certain behaviors carry you towards that end, and certain behaviors distract you from or carry you away from that end. Christianity is teleological. It depends upon what we might call final causality. Now, as moral limits have been pretty much abolished in modern culture, so has final causality. And that's just as significant. It's not unrelated, it's just as significant. In modern science, as I understand it, the idea of ends has been reduced pretty much to what we call efficient causality. The idea of cause has been reduced to efficient causality. One thing causes another, but there's no direction involved. I think it is the greatest and in some ways the most damaging contribution of Charles Darwin, that he destroys, gets rid of the need for final causality. Yes, there are causes, but evolution is just directionless. It has no end. That's a powerful philosophical contribution. Nietzsche, of course, fulminates against the idea of ends. To accord ends to nature, he would say, is to anthropomorphize in an illegitimate way. Nature is just random in the absolute sense of its end. And we see this too in politics and culture. Again, going back to moral limits, connect to ends. To say that certain things exist for certain purposes is seen as oppressive. Fascinates me the change in the debates about whether gay people should be allowed to get married. Required, of course, changes in the law. United Kingdom, United States, etc., etc. It's interesting, of course, that the changes in the law, marriage laws existed, at least in origin, primarily to protect children. We had marriage laws because we need safe environments for children. If you have a relationship that is by definition sterile, you shouldn't really need laws about it. Gay marriage emerges in a situation where the teleology of marriage has disappeared and the teleology of the law surrounding marriage has disappeared as well. Again, returning to a theme I spoke about yesterday, technology is clearly critical here. I used the example of Heidegger. And I said, Heidegger has this interesting contrast between building a bridge over a river and damming a river up to generate hydroelectric power. I could recast my interpretation of that using the language of this lecture and say, in the former case, the building of the bridge over the river's telos is respected. In the damming of the river to generate hydroelectric power, the telos of the river is utterly transformed. I mentioned yesterday that technology has transformed philosophies of medicine from restorative to transformative. It's interesting, my wife and I, about a year ago, I was invited to speak to dialogue at an event with a Muslim scholar in the United States, and we had dinner afterwards and were chatting, and he'd just returned, I think, a month or two before from the Vatican. And I asked him why he'd been at the Vatican, and he'd been for a 2-day conference on artificial intelligence. And he said it was interesting, and the conference was divided over 2 days. On day one, all of the tech gurus from around the world had been invited to speak. And on day two, various religious leaders, and he was representing Islam, had been invited to speak. He said the interesting thing was, he says, on day one, everybody was there. All the religious leaders were there and all the tech gurus were there. Tech gurus spoke. Day two, all the tech gurus had gone home. They weren't interested in the religious perspective. Because, of course, the religious perspective would want to regulate technology relative to ends. Tech generates its own ends, its own power. It creates a situation where we are impatient with limits. Limits come to be seen as problems. And as I said yesterday, even our own bodies come to be seen as raw material. And I could add here, as I draw things to a close, go to that question, what is a woman? What is a woman is only a difficult question to answer in a world that has got rid of the idea of teleology. I don't know if it's available in Dutch or German yet, but in English there is an excellent book by the Catholic gender theorist Abigail Favale. She teaches at Notre Dame. The book, it's very Catholic at points, so I'm not here giving a full endorsement to every paragraph on every page, but it's published by Ignatius Press. Its title is provocatively The Genesis of Gender. The chapter in there that summarizes gender theory, I think, is probably the most lucid and accessible summary of gender theory you'll find anywhere. And I had the privilege of interviewing Abby on my podcast about 18 months ago. And I started the podcast by asking her, I said, I'm going to ask you a question now that has perplexed the finest minds in the world at the moment, or seems to have done. Maybe not the finest minds, but public minds. I'm thinking of the shadow Labour minister in England, in Britain, for women's affairs. I was unable to define women when she was asked what a woman was in Parliament. Struck me as a little bit odd that the shadow minister for women's affairs did not know what she was representing. Famous case, Ketanji Brown Jackson in the United States, when she was going for her confirmation hearings for her appointment to the Supreme Court, was asked, can you define woman? And said, no, she was not a biologist, which was an entertaining answer for her to give, because actually that's the very, biologists are absolutely not the people who can define women in our current climate. But I asked Abby, I said, Abby, what is a woman? And because she is a devout Catholic, she was able to give me a definition. And I summarize it here. It took her a minute or two to give the definition. But a definition was essentially this. A woman is a human person whose body is normatively tailored towards gestation. Think about that. Now, it's an interesting definition. There are a couple of important things to notice there. The use of the word normative is important because there are women who are not married and have never born children. There are women who exist before the age of childbearing and after the age of childbearing. There are women born with no ovaries and no wombs. And we don't want to say that such people are not women. So normative is very important there, very important qualification. But just think about that. Think about that definition, how simple and straightforward it is. It becomes problematic in a world where the natural functions of the human body are seen to be oppressive. That's why the question, what is a woman, is so difficult today. Because we have 60, 70, 80 years of theory that says natural functions of human bodies, particularly those that are seen to economically disadvantage women over against men, these are problems to be overcome, not realities to be embraced. Think about that. In terms of the categories I've set up today, that's a rejection of teleology. That's a rejection of telos. Now, to summarize then, why should this be an encouragement to us all? Well, I hope to bring that out most clearly in the final lecture. But it should be encouraging on this front. We've now narrowed the problems. You don't have to go away and read great swathes of gender theory. You should be tremendously relieved about that. Gender theory, it's a completely different world of language and discussion. But you don't have to worry about the details. Why not? Because it boils down to this: a challenge to moral structure and a challenge to moral ends. We don't have to get too worried about being able to competently respond to every single argument out there. We need to be able to positively present the truth in a cheerful, I would say, a cheerful and loving manner, and that will be sufficient for addressing the problems we currently face. How we do that in detail, I want to come to in the final lecture, which, after all this bad news, will be all good news. I'll see you shortly.